Welcome to the AFCEA Leadership Forum 5-Question Series. I'm Bob Ackerman, the Editor-in-Chief of Signal Magazine. Today, we welcome Ward Carroll, Editor-in-Chief of We Are the Mighty. Ward's life features a highly diverse background in the military, news media, and entertainment. His 20-year Navy career included several tours in F-14 Tomcat squadrons and his alma mater, the U.S. Naval Academy. After leaving the Navy, he spent 9 years as an editor for military.com, and he has written for several media outlets and authored several works. Ward also has served as a technical advisor for military-themed films such as The Hunt for Red October and Flight of the Intruder. And he is an accomplished musician who has worked with the likes of Steve Morse and Cheap Trick. Ward, welcome again to AFCEA, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be here.
You have a broad range of experience in the military, the media, and entertainment. So let me ask you straight out, what would you say are the characteristics in an individual that mark that person as a potential leader?
There are myriad characteristics, Bob, as I'm sure you know. When you ask me that, the first thing I think of is Indoctrination Day at the Naval Academy. And I remember sort of sizing up my peer group. And on that day, you could tell who were the guys who were going to make it in terms of within the Navy structure. They sort of had this air about them. I think some of it is confidence, the way they carried themselves, and the also knowing, sort of presaging what was going to happen in that stressful environment of plebe summer and being able to weather that. The informal leaders emerged in short order. So by day 3, among our peers, the plebes, we sort of knew who were the guys who had the information first, who were the guys who knew what was going to happen next, and who were the guys who were going to be strong under the pressure of the upperclassmen. So I would say the singular answer to the question is competence. Depending on what you're doing, whether you're flying fighters or running a website, technical competence, I think, is number one. There's also this sort of Groucho Marx thing where I want my leaders not to aspire for leadership, because that sort of turns into careerism and other sort of power grabs. In fact, my body of fiction work has sort of used that as the root note of naval officers who artificially aspire for power. And that generally doesn't work out too good in terms of how they run a command or what they do in terms of their political aspirations within the Navy. So I would say it's first and foremost is technical competence, and then secondly, I guess when I say you don't want to be in charge, it means you're not arrogant, and your motivations for accepting the responsibilities of command are pure.
Let me ask you this then. Is ambition a dirty word for leadership?
I think it depends on the nature of ambition. So I know a little bit about this in that I showed up at the Naval Academy having never been there. That's a huge leap of faith if you think about it. For me, it was sort of blind achievement. It was hard to get into, and it took me 2 tries. I had to go to prep school for a year, and then I got in. So maybe this is just the sort of what happens when you're 17 and 18 years old. You can't fully know what it is you're getting into. But I think to a deficit degree, I didn't fully consider what it was I was getting into. And then as I attended the Naval Academy, ironically, I enjoyed it for the college experience and didn't really consider the idea that I was going to have a job at the end of it, which is called being in the Navy, right? So I think I was ill-prepared to be a naval officer, for one thing. But so maybe a little bit of ambition is good, but I think it depends on the nature of that ambition. If the ambition is to lead men and create esprit and the war-fighting capability, then that's one thing. If the ambition is to make it to the next rank ahead of your peer group or get all the cool jobs like, be a Top Gun instructor or be admiral of that battle group or whatever, then I think, again, it'll play out poorly ultimately on how that manifests itself when you actually get into that position of power.
What then is the most important skill for a leader to have?
Lead by example. I think it's not what you say, it's what you do. So I've had so many CEOs and bosses that are great at the podium, can talk a great game. They bring it when it's time to sort of orate, or when it's time to punctuate their tenure with some 20-minute speech. So the question is, where is that guy or girl when the pressure's on, or when the chips are down, or when morale is being challenged? So the best CEOs I've ever worked for are the ones who show up first and leave last, and who don't imagine that they're anything but the best aviator in the case of a fighter squadron, the one who's studied the most of the tactical pubs or the mission you're about to do, the one who cares for the well-being of everyone else over themselves. So the old Marine Corps thing of, eat last, after your men, and just see to their well-being. So, and you can't fake that. You can fake caring for short bursts of time, but over the course of a deployment or a combat tour or whatever, if you're not sincerely involved in the lives of your charges, it'll show up. So for my money, it's those who lead by example.
Well, that sounds like a good template, but when do you know that your leadership style is working? What are the indicators?
Well, in the case of a command, there are metrics and there are quantitative values and this is the beauty of the military. Just like in business, if you hit your sales targets, or if a website makes its growth goals in terms of unique visitors or page views, then you're doing something right. But more subjectively, I think this is more in line with what the question is. What I've seen is when the leadership starts coming back to you from your subordinates. I remember when I was the operations officer in Fighter Squadron 102, and we were in fighting the Great Bosnian War of 1995. You've seen the movies; it's well documented. But we were all around Sarajevo, trying to break the siege, and we were also involved in close air support. The Tomcat community was starting to do close air support, and it was a brand new mission for us. We were doing forward air controller airborne stuff, and I had some hard-charging young junior officers who basically went to Vicenza, to the Joint Command there, and sold the Tomcat's capabilities, and came back and said, okay, we need to go to the following places in Banja Luka and other places in country, and be present with the Army units, so we are the ones who are there, top of mind when it's time for close air support. These lieutenants were not told to do any of that. So basically, they took the tone that was set at the department head and the CO level and brought it back to us in spades. So we broke all flying records that year. We won the Battle Efficiency Awards. It was just fantastic tenure. And those guys went on to command squadrons, and that year group, it was year group 91, was just really, really a bunch of superstars. So when they started coming back to me, just like as a father, when your kids come back and start showing you that they have learned or listened in ways you didn't notice, that is when you know that you're doing things right in terms of the tone you set and how you're leading by example.
Well, that's a success story. Not everything in life as a leader turns out to be successful. What would you say was your greatest failure, and what did you learn from it?
It's hard to pick one out, Bob. I've had so many. In fact, my failures, the sort of sum total, the confluence of my failures, is why I became a novelist. And so my body of fiction is, the predicate there is my failures. But I think singularly in the Navy, my greatest failure was my first tour. And as we were talking about before, I left the Naval Academy, went through flight school, and I was not professionally up to speed, which is a way of saying that I was professionally immature. And as an aviator, you can get away with it through flight school because you're just worried about yourself. So when I showed up to Fighter Squadron 32, I was the #1 draft pick. I was the top backseater in my F-14 RAG class, which is the F-14 training squadron. So I was picked to go right on deployment, got on deployment, and was given a ground job and did that ground job very poorly. Now, enjoyed being in the airplane, took that role very seriously, but what I didn't understand, or if I understood it, I didn't take it all the way it needed to go, was that you needed to be an officer and the officer needed to take a lot of over and above time to take care of the troops. So I was in charge of the guys who were on TAD away from the squadron, temporary active duty away from the squadron, down on the mess decks and on various places of the ship. And so that was a job that, you're tired after flying and everything, and you needed to walk from the upper decks down to the lower decks and go find these guys sometimes in their bunks. And, it took a lot of effort. And sometimes, too many times, I didn't take the effort to make them feel like they were part of the squadron. And as a result, when they got to the squadron, they were disoriented and it took them a while to get up to speed. And my CO noticed that. And so I paid for it in terms of my fitness reports and other things. And my attitude, I was arrogant. I was, I think of, 25-year-old Ward Carroll, Lieutenant J.G. Carroll. I had a lot to learn. So the thing about the Navy and the fighter community, it's very small and insular. So if you have a bad fit rep as a Lieutenant JG, that is ultimately going to hurt you. And you think, oh no, you can get over that. But ultimately, I never was able to, although I had some fantastic tours after that, but so did my peer group. So when it gets to the crunch, it's like when you tie in golf. You take your scorecards and you start walking back until there's a hole that somebody beat somebody else. And in my case, my peers, we all did great, 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 and then you get back to that first tour, and I had a series of fit reps that weren't as good. So it hurt me in terms of screening for command. That I learned the lesson at about the 11-year mark that I should have known at about the 2-year mark. So again, I'm lucky in that I was able to shape that angst and that realization into a pivot that actually informed my literary career, which has actually informed my professional career of working in the .com space now in a very, it's the most unorthodox networking I've ever seen. The other thing I had with, and this is the beauty of the Navy, I had the gift of being able to take my lessons and give them back to fledgling officers, actually midshipmen, because my last tour in the Navy was teaching at the Naval Academy. So a gift given to me by Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the battle group commander when I was the operations officer, and he kind of made those orders happen. And so there's kind of symmetry to it, to begin and end at the Naval Academy. And I was also able to write my first novel while on the staff there, because when you're teaching English, it's not fraud, waste, and abuse, to be writing a novel. When you're in a fighter squadron, it is. It was rewarding and had a spiritual thread for me able to relate my lessons of my first tour to those who were very much like I was at that age. The same appetites, you could tell. And I wish somebody had said to me that when I was their age, this is a job. And you think because you win here that somebody owes you something, but they don't. ROTC people from OCS, other accession sources are going to show up hungry. And if you're not hungry, you're going to lose. I'm not saying be a careerist. I'm not saying be a backstabber. I'm just saying take the responsibilities of the job of the Navy as seriously as you do the fun part of flying jets and driving subs or whatever else you're going to do. So again, the beauty of this family that is the Navy, I've had students come back to me years later. In fact, I flew with the Blue Angels a couple of years ago. I was able to fly in Blue Angel number 4 position. The guy who was flying number 3 came to me and said, "Sir, you were one of my instructors." He said, "You don't remember this, but you gave me this little speech one time when I was down and told me it would get better, and in fact it did." I almost wept. I mean, here's a Blue Angel telling me that I'm kind of this, my guidance helped him stay in the Navy, and now he's obviously very successful as a Blue Angel. So that feels good. I can take my failure and turn it into something else that maybe helps others, and as a result, it's not a malignancy. It's healthy. So that has also allowed me to transition into a civilian career with sort of a healthy outlook. My life at age 55 is anything but over. I've shifted into overdrive in terms of my desires and everything else, and that's a trick too. Making a military transition into something that is rewarding is a trick. And I know a lot of guys who haven't been able to. They're strangers on this earth out of uniform. And when you retire at age 42, you still got a lot of work ahead of you. So it's a shame if, it's like a Bruce Springsteen song, right? Glory days, like everything's behind you. So again, I've been able to pivot on my failures and learn from them into, not repeating them in most cases.
You've just described an example that you set for someone else and applying your own expertise to help that person choose the right path. All throughout your life up to this point, I would like to ask you, who are your heroes and how did they serve as role models?
Well, I don't want to be cliche, but my original hero is my father. So he was a Marine Corps aviator, the great Santini of sorts. He was in the Marine Corps for 30 years as an attack pilot. So my childhood was spent around cockpits and airplanes and, imagine being able to watch your father fly in and get out of the airplane and, that sort of thing. But I say the great Santini, but he wasn't the great Santini in terms of his outlook, because he's also a man of refinement and taste, a clarinet player, a man of letters. So he informed my judgment in matters of art and, literature and sports and, everything else. So he's my first hero. My second series of heroes are figures in pop culture. And this is why I've gravitated to the entertainment space. So it starts with the Beatles. So I'm a Paul guy. You're either a Paul guy or a John guy. I'm a Paul guy. And so I think what I like about Paul McCartney is, for all of his fame, he's still a super nice guy. His art, his body of work is lighthearted and soulful, and also has an import to it. So I think, and lyrically, everything else, he's been a great influence on my writing. Ironically, you say the Beatles influence writing. Yes, in fact, they do. But in terms of writers, I gravitate towards guys who haven't taken the traditional path, like Jack Kerouac, Kurt Vonnegut, students of the human condition in sort of a tangential way. And then the last guy I would cite as a hero is General Stanley McChrystal. And I had the gift of being able to talk to him at length a few weeks ago. And the reason I say him is because the first time I met him, I was embedded in Afghanistan in my previous job with military.com, and I had a chance to interview him in Kabul. This was May of 2010, and a few weeks later, the Rolling Stone article came out, and he was fired. So this interview, I sort of started with, do you mind if we talk about that? And he said, you can ask me, but I won't answer. So I'm like, what's up? And he said, well, if I answer that question, it defines me. And I think what you'll see in the course of this discussion is I'm not allowing that chapter of my life to define me. And I thought that was brilliant. And we had a fantastic discussion about, he's got this national service initiative that he's working on. So if you go to Alexandria and you look at the McChrystal Group, it's this fantastic tech, 21st century bleeding edge industry sort of organization. It looks like Facebook Spaces would look. And so he very much is a guy who doesn't live in the past. And super articulate, super in touch with modern day America, and just a really nice guy. So he's a hero of mine as well, for the fact that he hasn't allowed a singular failure to define the rest of his life. And in many ways, the machine wants, especially the pop culture machine, wants that to be the case. If you live in infamy, they want you to stay there. And the more resilient among us, those who should be admired and imitated, like Stanley McChrystal, don't allow it to be the case.
What would you say is the single thread that connects those four heroes of yours?
They're all iconoclasts. They are leaders, not in what they say, but in what they do. So I think in life, it's that American Sniper thing. There are sheep and there are sheepdogs, right? I admire the sheepdogs. I think all those folks that I've listed are sheepdogs. They're iconoclasts, and they've led not with what they said, but with what they did.
Well, Ward, thank you very much for giving us your insights and perspective on leadership.
My pleasure.
We appreciate your support and good luck on all your endeavors.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
I'm Bob Ackerman. You've been watching the AFCEA Leadership Forum 5 Question Series.